We're extraordinarily fortunate tonight to have one of America's most distinguished public servants with us. As mentioned earlier, he's had more than 4 decades of that public service in positions of extraordinary responsibility. He's been ambassador to 4 countries and to the United Nations. He's been the director of national intelligence, the first such when we centralized our intelligence organization. And he's been the Deputy Secretary of State, which is the number 2 position in the department. So it'd be very hard indeed to find anybody who's had broader ranging experience, more opportunity to gain the kind of extensive experience and wisdom and judgment that a man needs to be in the position of the Deputy Secretary of State or the Director of National Intelligence. He's kindly agreed to answer questions from students when he finishes his talk. And so we'll now hear from Ambassador Negroponte, a distinguished career diplomat and public servant. John?
Thank you, Joe. I appreciate your kind words of introduction, and I appreciate all the courtesies that have been extended to me in the very few hours that I've been here in Provo, but I'm most grateful for them. And starting with being met at the airport by Michael, and then a very excellent dinner that we just had with the president of the university and some of the trustees and the founder of the Wheatley institution and the former president of the university. So this has really been quite a treat for me, and I've tried to learn a little bit about what your institution does and the reach that you seem to have, and I guess that your community seems to have around the world, because everybody gets an opportunity at some kind of service abroad. And to me, that's music to my ears. I wish more Americans had that kind of experience. I cannot tell you how many times I would sit in a National Security Council meeting when I was either the Director of National Intelligence or the Deputy Secretary of State, and I looked around the table and I asked myself, how many of these people, here we are talking about global issues, and how many of them have lived abroad? And, well, there was myself, yeah, I knew that, and then I looked and I said, well, the military, they probably have, because that sort of goes with the territory. You serve abroad, but you usually either live in a trench or you live in a tent or you live at a military base. You're not usually living in the economy. But it was quite striking to me how few of the others had actually lived abroad. So I just think that that's invaluable experience to prepare individuals for working in modern times when we are so interdependent in this world, and where 95% of the world's population live somewhere else besides the United States. I joined the Foreign Service in 1960. It was the very end of the Eisenhower administration. My first commission was signed as a Foreign Service officer, was signed by Dwight D. Eisenhower, and then I spent 37 years in the service, left for 4 years to go to the private sector, and then when George W. Bush was elected, he invited me back to serve as the ambassador to the United Nations, and then I ended up having a sequence of jobs in the Bush administration for which I will be ever grateful to President Bush for having given me the opportunity, first as UN ambassador, then as ambassador to Iraq, then as the first director of national intelligence, and lastly, I ended my career as the deputy Secretary of State. But I had 9 postings abroad during the course of my career in 4 different continents. The concentration of my career was in Asia and in Latin America. I served in Hong Kong. That was my first assignment. I served in Vietnam when the Vietnam situation was heating up back in the early 1960s. I was asked if I wanted to volunteer for that, and I did, and it turned out to be a career-defining experience for me. In fact, so career-defining that I couldn't get away from it. I spent almost 4 years in Vietnam, and then I got recruited to be in the Paris peace talks on Vietnam, and then I thought I'd gotten away from it, and no, Henry Kissinger wanted me to come and work on the National Security Council, where I was his director for Vietnam during the time that we negotiated the final withdrawal agreement in 1973, which we signed in early 1973. I've also had policy jobs in Washington. I mentioned one, the directorship for Vietnam and the National Security Council. I was the deputy National Security Advisor at one point. And as was mentioned, I was the Deputy Secretary of State. And then I had this excursion into intelligence, being the Director of National Intelligence. And a number of people at the time asked, well, what the heck, why are they putting an ambassador or a diplomat in charge of overseeing our intelligence community? But in fact, the disciplines are related. They're interrelated. You can't... diplomats rely on intelligence to start with, to gain better understanding of circumstances and situations and people. And they also generate a certain amount of intelligence through their diplomatic reporting. Because one of our principal functions as Foreign Service officers, particularly in the earlier stages of our career, is reporting and analysis. Really interesting things to do, actually. When I was in Vietnam as a young officer, I was a provincial reporting officer, and I covered 7 different provinces in Vietnam, and I'd go out one week, I'd visit a province, I'd collect economic, political, military, social information, then I'd come back to, we didn't have the internet, of course, and Blackberries and all of that, have to come back to Saigon, write up my reports on a yellow legal pad, and then a secretary would type them up, and we'd cable them in to Washington, get my laundry done, and then go back out the following week again and visit another province, and so it went. But our reports, it turned out that if you go out, spend time talking to people, maybe the first time you go out, you just get a rough idea of what's happening. But once you've visited a province for the 5th or 6th time, you become pretty familiar with what's going on. So that was an important part of my career, and I think it related and it helped me in my job as setting up this new directorate of national intelligence, as did the fact of having run 5 different embassies where we had intelligence people serving and where I'd had a lot of interaction with them there. So in these, what turns out to be, Michael, 44 years in total of government, I thought I'd start, first of all, we'll get to the current situation, but I was trying to distill as I was flying here from Washington today, what are some of the lessons that I've drawn from a career in national security, and I wanted to lay a few of these out here for your consideration. The first, and I think is an important one, it's that we are still the richest and most powerful nation in the world. And sometimes the way I hear people talk about current events, I think people lose sight of that fact. We're not on our back foot. We're not on our heels. We're not a country in decline. Sure, like everybody else, we suffered from the economic setbacks of 2007 and 2008, the whole financial crisis. But I think that's well on the way to resolution. And our economy is still, by far, the strongest in the world. China is definitely giving us a run for the money. And one day, in aggregate terms, I think perhaps the Chinese GDP, even in our lifetimes, could be larger than ours. But the per capita income, as you know, is going to not compare in any way. And when you think of the quality of life in China, they also have a long way to go. Although I don't want to deprecate the great lengths that China has come since the reform era of 1978 under launched by Deng Xiaoping back in the late 1970s. But if you think about it, the United States has been the world's largest economy probably since sometime in the latter part of the 19th century. That's when we overtook Great Britain as the world's largest economy. And it's kind of interesting to see that we didn't immediately adopt a political role commensurate with our economic strength. It seems that requires a certain political maturation process that took place, and really we ended up being launched on the world scene as a result of our involvement in World War I and the role we tried to play in the post-war settlement, Woodrow Wilson and so forth. And of course, our leadership role became categorically apparent, if you will, in World War II, both in the conduct of that war and in the post-war arrangements that were negotiated, the creation of the United Nations, the Bretton Woods economic agreements, and so forth. And we played a strong leadership role ever since. In the Cold War, of course, instrumental in leading to ultimately to the demise of the Soviet Union. And that brings us, of course, to today, and we'll get back to the current situation shortly. The third or the second point that I'd like to make is that I've learned through my 44 years in the Foreign Service that the incredible importance of the role of the President in the execution and direction and execution of our foreign policy and of our national security policy. I'm not sure that in some countries there's quite the appreciation of how concentrated the power of the President and how important Article 2 of the Constitution is in terms of carrying out our national security and foreign policies abroad. Surely, to be sure, the Congress has policy-making roles, and it has a power of the purse. But when push comes to shove, it is really the President who provides the leadership and the direction. And history is, of course, replete with examples of this going all the way back to the beginning of the Republic, through the Civil War, through the First World War, through the Second World War, and through the Cold War, and up to this very date. An interesting point about this is that unlike a parliamentary system, let's say in Great Britain, where a prime minister may have had a whole bunch of other cabinet positions beforehand and am deeply involved in the formulation of government policy, a president can sometimes arrive in his first term in office with practically no foreign policy experience, and with the hope and intent of having a strong domestic agenda and hoping to keep the foreign policy issues a little bit on the back burner, if you will. Woodrow Wilson wrote a note to himself in one of his diaries that he hoped the problems over there in Europe weren't going to interfere with his plans for domestic reform. Well, he got some domestic reform to be done, to be sure, particularly the Federal Reserve Bank and a few other things. But he was definitely up to his neck in foreign policy issues once the United States entered World War I. And then, of course, with the whole end of his life, of his active life, was devoted to trying to restore peace through the Versailles process and the negotiations of the end of World War I. Bill Clinton, in his inaugural address, his first inaugural, I think he had one sentence about foreign policy. And in some respects, I think the current president had hoped to sort of push the foreign policy and the national security agenda a little bit to the back so that he could put his domestic agenda in the forefront. And in one sense, he really had reason, because we were coming through this enormous financial crisis. And he wanted to get Iraq and Afghanistan behind us, but about which we'll talk a little more later. Another lesson from my experience has had to do with the role of diplomacy and the role of ambassadors. When you think of diplomacy, let's say on the grand scale, you think of major treaties and major diplomatic accomplishments, some of which were absolutely extraordinary, of extraordinary importance for our country. The Louisiana Purchase, for example, which Thomas Jefferson executed. The purchase of Alaska by Seward. I mean, what a good deal. Was it $7 million for Alaska? There have also been some notable failures. The Treaty of Versailles that we were talking about earlier. But at a different level, perhaps a little bit more mundane, and what people like myself are more used to, diplomacy is a day-to-day activity conducted by the United States government, principally by the Department of State, although there are other agencies of our government, such as the U.S. Trade Representative or the Defense Department, that carry out the Commerce Department extensive, myriad transactions literally every day with counterparts around the world. I can't tell you how complex. Just to take one embassy, for example, I was our ambassador to Mexico for 4 years. A relationship such as that can be. When I had my staff meeting every day in Mexico City, there were 33 different federal agencies were represented at my daily staff meeting. So think of all the different things: border, customs, multiple law enforcement agencies, the FBI, the DEA. All of these people had representatives in my embassy and were carrying out relationships with their counterparts and trying to make arrangements so that we could have a smoother and more beneficial, mutually beneficial conduct of the relationship between our two countries. Not to mention the fact that at the same time we were having a major free trade negotiation with Mexico, which ultimately led to the creation of the North American Free Trade Agreement. Sometimes people ask me, well, gee, with modern communications and all these different things, aren't ambassadors irrelevant? I mean, aren't you just a messenger boy? Can't all this business be conducted now directly between the president on the one hand and his counterpart on another, or the Secretary of State can call his counterpart? Well, there's a certain amount of truth to that, but not that much. And why do I say that? First of all, any country, certainly one of the stature of the United States, is going to want to have people on the ground who can give a faithful, reliable, in-depth assessment of what is happening in that country, to understand the different factors and currents and cross-currents that are at work. And you can't do that from a great distance. You think you might be able to, but all of you know that there's an enormous difference between understanding a situation virtually, let's say, with a teleconference, or an email or a telegram, as opposed to being right there and knowing the person that you deal with. I used to, when I was deputy secretary, attend part of the orientation of our ambassadors who were going abroad for the first time. They were going abroad as ambassadors for the first time, and a number of them were political appointees. And I said, don't forget, you cannot abdicate your eyes and ears responsibility to your deputy or anybody else, because if the President of the United States visits your country, the country that you're assigned to, when he arrives at the airport, he's going to jump into his limousine and bring you in with him, and he's going to expect you to give him the top-notch briefing on the current situation before 45 minutes later he's going to meet the president or the host, the leader of the country which he's visiting. So you're the eyes and ears, you're the faithful understanding of the place, and you can pass and you can do a fair amount of the negotiating, the clearing away of the underbrush, teeing up agreements so that the higher level people can move in at the later stage when you're coming to closure. There are a lot of different things that ambassadors can and do, and I think in some respects, particularly if Washington has confidence in an ambassador, it's quite surprising how much latitude and leeway they have in carrying out and in implementing and even formulating American policies. So let me talk just a little bit about today's global picture, and maybe I could start by talking a bit about what I think are the fundamentals of our foreign policy. It seems to me that when we go out to represent our country, or when we're in the State Department, the things that we think about the most are the security and safety of the United States, the prosperity and the well-being of our country, and the faithful representation, if you will, of our political and economic values, our commitment to democracy and our commitment to free market systems. And all of these things start at home. I mean, if we don't have a strong military and a strong security establishment, if we don't have a healthy and strong economy, the rest may not matter that much. That, it seems to me, is the indispensable precondition for an effective and successful national security policy. Now, supplementing that, I'd say the next most important thing is our alliances. It's very important to keep our friendships and our alliances in good shape. And we have some absolutely critical alliances around the world that really have been the cornerstone of our international security policy for generations, ever since the beginning of the Cold War. So I suppose you'd say foremost amongst those alliances is the alliance with NATO, which is now 26 countries. And then there's the alliance with Japan, probably the most important relationship that we have, certainly the most important security relationship we have in the Asia-Pacific region. And then with South Korea, another treaty ally, and then the Philippines and Thailand, which also happen to be allies, and Australia. And along with these security arrangements that we have with these countries, we have a network of economic relationships. I mentioned briefly earlier on the Bretton Woods system that was established after World War II, that set up the World Bank, the IMF, the different regional banks, and so forth. But we also have these free trade arrangements. We have free trading agreements with some 23 countries around the world, I believe. Certainly important amongst those is the North American Free Trade Agreement, agreements that we have with some countries in the Middle East, Jordan, Israel, Morocco, agreement with Australia, agreement with South Korea, and several others. In Latin America as well, Panama, Peru, Chile, the Central American countries. So that is a kind of a network, an economic network of countries that have a like-minded view and a philosophy towards investment, for example, and settlement of disputes, and transparency of economic arrangements, and freedom of trade, of course. And there are two major trading arrangements that are being negotiated at this very moment that are of strategic importance. There's the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is being negotiated amongst some 12 countries, including Japan and Vietnam, several other Southeast Asian countries, and then Mexico and Colombia and Canada. It adds up to 12 in all, Malaysia. And then there's a transatlantic trade and investment partnership that's being negotiated between the United States and the European Union. So if you think of it, if you take, in addition to the 23 or so free trade agreements we have already, and then you add these two mega arrangements, one on the Atlantic and one on the Pacific, we're really moving fast towards the notion of linking major parts of the world together economically. But this still does leave, if you look at this alliance framework and the different economic arrangements, it still does leave a bit of a gap. And what is that gap? The gap, of course, is some of the rising powers that are not necessarily part of these arrangements that we're talking about. I suppose foremost amongst which you'd have to mention the country of China. And you'd have to certainly mention Russia, especially in light of some of the issues that have arisen with Russia in recent months. And you would have to mention or raise a number of other parts of the developing world. And what I would say is, when you move outside the area of our alliances and close economic relationships, you really have two categories of countries. You have these rising countries, China, Russia, India, Brazil, the BRICS, actually. They call themselves, by the acronym, the BRICS. They formed an association with each other. Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And then, in addition to these rising countries, you have the ones that are in a little bit more trouble. And there I think you'd have to talk about major parts of the Middle East, many of which are not adequately integrated with the rest of the global economy, and which have been subject to extraordinary instability and violence in the past couple of decades. So now, within this group of countries and issues, where do we stand today, and what are the problems that are really posing the greatest challenge to American foreign policy? I guess I would have to start with the Middle East. It's a toss-up. Sometimes the Middle East and with international terrorism. Sometimes I wake up in the morning and I think that maybe the Russian problem in the Ukraine is more serious than the problem of the Middle East and terrorism, and then I oscillate back and forth depending. And I think a lot of people have the same ambivalence about which problem is more challenging, but they're both difficult. And let me start with the Middle East. When I was ambassador to Iraq, of course, we had close to 100,000 troops there, and we had a large assistance program. But that was back in 2004, 2005. At the end of 2011, we withdrew the last United States combat troops. And I think that since that time, the situation and in Iraq has deteriorated considerably. And I think perhaps one of the most important contributing, I think there were two contributing factors. One is the fact that we left. I think it was a pity that we were not able to negotiate the continued presence of a small residual force to provide needed intelligence support, logistics support, advice, and so forth. It didn't have to be a large force, but it would have been good if we could have kept 10, 15, 20,000 troops there to provide in an advisory and support role, not a combat role. But the truth of the matter is the Iraqi government didn't want it. And it was too neuralgic a political issue for them. If they'd signed this so-called status of forces agreement with us that it would have permitted these troops to stay, they would have had to pass it through their Congress, and there were elements in their Congress that would have simply filibustered any kind of possible residual forces agreement with the United States. So we left. The other complicating factor was that the situation in Syria started to deteriorate, as we all know, and the old Al-Qaeda in Iraq group, that's the group that was there and very active when I was in Iraq, had morphed itself into what today we call ISIS or ISIL, the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. They developed a certain amount of strength in Syria, then they started sending people over to Iraq, and then eventually in recent months they've developed control over significant swaths of territory between the two countries, to the point that we woke up a couple of months ago, and lo and behold, this ISIL was starting to practically march down the two main river arteries of Iraq, the Tigris and the Euphrates River, and they captured Mosul, they've captured Fallujah, they've captured other places. And all of a sudden people were asking themselves, well, my goodness, are they going to be in Baghdad tomorrow or something? And at that point, that combined with a couple of these absolutely ghastly, horrific executions of prisoners, Western prisoners that they've captured, sort of energized American and I think Western and Arab reaction generally, so that we got to the point where in recent weeks the president has really done pretty much of an about-face with respect to the policies that he'd been conducting there before. First of all, he's now prepared to countenance and has already begun carrying out some air attacks in Syria, which you'll remember a year ago he was on the verge of doing and then decided not to, pulled back from it, I think to the surprise of many and to the disappointment of quite a few. And he's sent some, not combat troops, not in the sense of large infantry units that are going to go do the fighting themselves, but he has sent troops back to Iraq to provide an important support role to the Iraqi and Kurdish forces in that country to help them acquire sufficient stability and capacity to push this ISIL back. I don't doubt the commitment of the president to try to turn this thing around, and I think some very positive steps have really been taken to accomplish that, because he's now done 3 or 4 things that none of which he'd done before. He's made a move in Syria. He's put some troops, some forces back into Iraq. He's carried out some airstrikes in Iraq as well, and he's signaled very clearly that he sees this as a long-term problem. He seems to be saying, I understand that this is going to be a problem through what remains of my time in office and will likely be a problem well beyond. And personally, I think that's the right assessment. I think anybody who thinks is asking the question, how many days or how many weeks or how many months is going to take, is must be smoking that peace pipe that was given to me at at dinner and putting the wrong stuff in it. This is going to take months and years, not days and weeks, and it's going to involve. People talk about boots in the ground. If it's not going to, you can't do this all with airstrikes and drones. I mean, I think it's foolish to think that you can. They can play a role, particularly against the more visible targets. They can give people a psychological boost. People on the ground are saying, well, the Americans are with us again. At least they're doing something. Whereas for a little while, they wondered whether we just completely lost interest. But in the end, there's no substitute for ground forces, both military and police, of that country itself, reestablishing governmental authority and extending its writ throughout the country. You cannot claim to be a self-respecting sovereign state of a country like Iraq when the second largest city in the country is under control of the enemy. That's a totally unacceptable situation. So my caveat about all of this is the question that I think those of us with enough gray hairs here, or too little hair, know is a question that has dogged us in the past, which is, will we have the patience to stick this out? I don't think it's going to cost us a lot of casualties, but I think it's going to cost us time, effort, money, and we got to be willing to put that up for a sustained period of time. And I hope that we have that kind of stick-to-itiveness, but the record of recent history isn't necessarily that encouraging. So I guess the question you'd have to ask yourself is, well, what makes this situation so different from what Mr. Obama was looking at just a couple of years ago that we're now ready to really stay the course? Well, I think we're going to have to wait and see, but I would certainly be among those who would applaud what he's done and encourage him to stay the course. One other point I'd make here, because I think, and my expertise is really more on Iraq because I was ambassador there, but I think the Iraq situation is a little easier to see and understand than the Syrian one, which is opaque. No one's really gotten in there. I mean, these forces are fighting each other, but it's not as if there's a lot of transparency as to what's going on. And it's gotten very complicated because we are fighting ISIL, which is also an enemy of the regime, and we don't have much use for the regime either. So the Syria issue is a lot more complex, and I would confess that I have a little more difficulty in seeing how best to address that situation. And what we're doing as far as helping the Free Syrian Army and training this group of 5,000 or so soldiers is a fairly modest effort when you think about what they are up against. On the other hand, who knows what this bombing of ISIL will do? Who knows how long the Bashar al-Assad, the Syrian regime, will last? There are a lot of imponderables there, and I confess to not seeing my way as clearly through that. But I happen to believe that the Iraq part is the priority part too. If you believe in a strategy, in sequencing a strategy, it seems to me the Iraq part is really the one that has to be addressed earlier than the Syrian one. Maybe we could just shift to Russia for a moment, because that's been the other complex problem that's been facing us in recent months. It's kind of interesting that back in the 2008 political campaign, 2012, Governor Romney was saying that Russia was the major threat to the United States and all the sophisticates in Washington were kind of chuckling about that, and none of us, I mean, myself included, I wasn't too sure why he was saying that. And of course, he looks rather clairvoyant at this point, given the way Mr. Putin has behaved in the last couple of years. And so I guess you have to ask yourself, first of all, what's at work here? And I think that this is a man who has said that he thought that the breakup of the Soviet Union was the greatest catastrophe of the 20th century. And I think that back in the 1990s, after the Soviet Union fell apart, Russia was not in an economic position really to assert itself. Its GDP had dropped, there was economic disarray and so forth. And since that time, particularly since the advent of Mr. Putin, the economy has improved dramatically, with a great rise in oil and gas production, as well as a pretty substantial rise in oil and gas prices, which has put Russia in a position to be able to assert itself economically again. And in addition to that, I think that it's also given Mr. Putin the nerve, if you will, to react to some of these events of the 1990s that the Russians view with considerable regret, like the expansion of NATO, among other things. And I think one of the turning points, and I saw this when I was Deputy Secretary of State in the last administration, was in 2008, in the spring, at the NATO summit meeting in Bucharest. NATO invited Georgia, the country of Georgia, and the country of Ukraine to join the alliance. Mentioned in the final communique that they look forward to these two countries becoming members of the alliance. And I think that may have been what sort of was the starting point, if you will, of this most recent series of events, because it wasn't long thereafter that the Russians invaded the country of Georgia. And I always felt when they did that, that one of the purposes was to send the message to the West that we shouldn't even think about trying to incorporate Georgia into NATO. And I think they were even more concerned about any possibility that the United States and NATO might bring the Ukraine into NATO membership. So I think that the basis or the underlying explanation of Mr. Putin's behavior in seizing the Crimea, in trying to foster unrest in eastern Ukraine, is to send a message to this country in what the Russians call their near abroad, to say, look, we're going to limit your room for international maneuver, and we want to have a voice in some of these critical foreign policy decisions that you make. Now, he doesn't say it quite that explicitly, but clearly that's the message that is being sent. And I recall that when the new prime minister of the Ukraine came to office and they asked him, well, are you still interested in NATO membership? He said, well, that's not on our radar screen at the moment. Now, subsequently, some in Ukraine have started talking again about the possibility of NATO membership. But I believe that Mr. Putin will do everything he can to prevent that from happening. So, in my view, what's happening is this nostalgia for the Soviet era, this trying to repair, at least somewhat, this greatest catastrophe of the 20th century, as Putin would call it, is this effort on the part of the Russians to reassert their influence in the bordering countries. And Ukraine has a particularly special meaning in Russian history because of the way the Russian state was originally formed. And so I think that's a particularly sensitive issue for the Russians, given also the fact that the Black Sea Fleet is situated in the Ukraine. Well, now it's situated in the Crimea, but which they took over just outright. So will this lead to some further encroachment by Mr. Putin into other parts of Europe? Is he going to go after the Baltic states next? Is he going to use the fact that some of these countries have large Russian-speaking populations in their countries? You can't be sure. We have in past history, we've sometimes underestimated the willingness of authoritarian figures to take risk. We certainly did that in the case of World War II with both the Japanese and the Germans. But is that the situation we're facing today, or isn't it? My own view is the fact that, in a way, these countries in Eastern Europe got in under the wire in terms of joining NATO. And since they have that protection of the NATO treaty and Article 5, the attack on one is attack on all, I'm not sure that Mr. Putin would ever want to take that big a risk. But so I think that at the moment, at least, the best I can foresee would be that continued pressure on some of the neighboring states that are not NATO members. But the question still remains, would he ever contemplate doing something beyond? What's the challenge for American diplomacy here? It seems to me this is something that really requires a lot of effort and a lot of work. This is a huge diplomatic challenge for us, among other things. I mean, we have to shore up the defenses of the Western European countries. We have to help the Ukraine to the extent we can, but we've also got to try to get inside of the heads of the leadership of Russia to see if there are ways that we can find to normalize things and bring them back to a somewhat more comfortable course of events, because what's happened lately, frankly, is dangerous. Not because I think any conflagration is imminent, but because there are just too many uncertainties out there and too many risks for misunderstanding. And I also get the impression that Mr. Putin, sometimes I wonder if he isn't improvising some of his policy. Wake up in the morning and say, well, what am I going to do today to get them upset? You tell me. It's a conundrum when especially when you're dealing with a quite authoritarian leader who would appear to have all the levers of control in his own hand. I don't see that there's some alternative pole or source of power that is dealing with these things. I would say that, just as an aside, this is one of the really interesting challenges in the intelligence community, is leadership analysis. How do you understand some of these people? How do you get into the minds of people whose societies are relatively closed or whose leadership procedures are quite closed? How do you understand what the Ayatollah in Tehran is thinking, or the North Koreans? I mean, and it's a very, very interesting subset of intelligence tradecraft, is doing good leadership analysis, and it's hard come by, and it takes a variety of different disciplines to be able to do that. But it can be extremely important when you're dealing with dangerous authoritarian countries. Last thing I thought I'd mention before, I know I've gone beyond my time here, but before opening it up to questions, and I'm sure cover a lot of ground with a question and answer period, but is China, because we really ought to end on the note of China. And I have some experience in that because I served in Hong Kong, where you did your mission, right? Once upon a time. I was in Hong Kong as my first Foreign Service assignment, 1961 to 63, when there was a bamboo curtain. I mean, you couldn't get into China or out of it. The only people who could come in or out were like household help that came from Canton, and during Chinese New Year's, they worked in Hong Kong, they go back to Canton, or the different districts there during Chinese New Year's. But the rest of us, it was, so the only way we learned about China, I tell this to intelligence officers today, and they can't quite visualize it. The way we learned about China, we got all the Chinese newspapers from the mainland. We had a big warehouse in downtown Hong Kong, and we had a bunch of translators translating that everything was in those newspapers. That was source number one. Source number two was interviewing refugees, people who'd fled China. We had a big debate in the consulate back then about whether there was a famine in China. We had reports of famine. We now know historically that there was a famine. And of course today, today it would be so easy. You just send a few satellites over the country and you monitor this, that, and the other thing, but you'd find out in a matter of days whether there were food shortages and shortage of food production. But we were left to sort of having to puzzle all this stuff out. My next experience with China was going with Henry Kissinger to China in 1972, just after Mr. Nixon had made his trip there. I went with Kissinger in June of 72. Nixon went in February. And I went along with him because I was the Vietnam guy on the National Security Council, and we always, in those days, as long as the war was going on, we were always talking with all these foreign leaders about Vietnam. And then the country had nothing. It was a totally poor country. No cars, all bicycles. Those of you who've been to China know the story about how they've migrated from bicycles to cars. Now there are a lot of cars and practically no room for the bicycles to move anymore. And then when I was Deputy Secretary of State, I was in charge of the U.S.-China political dialogue. And the change in China in those 40 or so years has just been absolutely extraordinary. I mean, in 1979, when we established relations with China, I remember discussing in the State Department, what are we going to import from this country? Because we'd established relations and we could now trade. The embargo was finally lifted, and we debated what was it that we were going to buy. And of course now we buy everything. But that wasn't true back then. There was nothing. So it's amazing. And that combined with Deng Xiaoping's reforms have really led to the China that we see today. Now, when I was conducting the dialogue, I don't think the problem of the South China Sea and the exaggerated claims to the South China Sea that China has were quite so acute. They weren't being quite as assertive, and they weren't being quite as vocal. And in the last couple of years, that seems to have happened. It's more or less coincided with two things. First, the continued ascension of and growth of China's economy, economic and military strength. And of course, there's been a change in leadership and under Xi Jinping. And they seem to be striking a more nationalistic note in their behavior. Now, fortunately, so far, no serious conflict has broken out. It's been confined to skirmishes with the various states that where they have conflicting claims, the Philippines, Vietnam, and so forth. And maybe it'll just stay that way at like a low-grade fever, some kind of low level of conflict between these countries until they finally negotiate out their differences, which is what they should do. But in the meanwhile, it's concerning anytime you have that kind of dispute between half a dozen countries, really, because it isn't only the Philippines and Vietnam with whom they have these maritime disputes. They have them with Malaysia, they have with Taiwan, with several other countries as well. So that's been an issue. More concerning has been that they have the same argument with the Japanese over some islands in the Northeast Asia, part of in Northeast Asia, and which islands, they're rocks practically, that are under Japanese control. And we've had a couple of incidents where fighter planes have been flown over that area and so forth. And if there were ever any kind of conflictive situation to develop between Japan and China, that could be a very, very dire situation indeed. Having said all of that, it really seems to me that given where China seems to be headed, which is to be the largest economy in the world, and it's going to certainly grow in military power and influence, it behooves us to cultivate the best possible relationship that we can with the Chinese. There's no point in making bad relations or with China a sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy. I mean, if China really develops and demonstrates aggressive intentions, well, we'll learn about it soon enough. But absent that, I think it's in our interest to work on all aspects of the relationship: economic, political, military, more military transparency. And I think that's getting better now. When I was working on this dialogue, we couldn't get high-ranking Chinese military officers to participate in it. Now there's much more interchange between our military officers, and I think that's a good idea. I heard the Chief of Naval Operations the other day saying that he'd had 4 meetings with his Chinese counterpart in the last year, and I consider that to be a positive thing. And the more of those counterpart encounters that take place, the better. And I think we also have to try to find, and Dr. Kissinger makes this point very frequently, we have to find areas where we have a common interest on which we can work together. And those do exist. I can think of some major issues where we have common interests, such as global warming, such as different aspects of the security situation in other parts of the world, like piracy off the coast of Africa. There are areas where we can do projects together to try to build confidence between our two countries. But I dwell a bit on China because clearly that is going to be, perhaps already is, but certainly will become America's most important bilateral relationship in the decades ahead. So maybe I can end on that note and then open it up to some questions, if that's okay. You want to get closer to the mic, a little bit closer? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Oh, it's on now. There we go.
So, given what looks like what will become a multipolar world, what do you think would be, if you had your choice, America's role of leadership in that world?
Well, I don't think we can escape a leadership role. I don't think it would be wise to try. I think first of all, our military strength is such that we really have no peer there. You can almost take the military budgets of every other country and they add up to the size of our military budget, and something like that is going to continue for quite a while. And the economy, of course, is extremely strong. So I think we I think we just have to continue to step up to it. And I think countries look to us to do that. When I was ambassador to the United Nations, I was negotiating Security Council resolutions. We're in that chamber of 15, not out in the formal chamber that you see when we're voting in the plenaries, but in the back in the consultation room. And these other countries, the representatives, were looking to see what was going to be the position of the United States. I think people still see us as a point of reference on a lot of different issues. So I think we need to continue our role, but to recognize that perhaps our relative influence has declined somewhat, and that we've really got to the maximum extent possible to do these endeavors in some kind of interdependent way, and that if you go in and do things with friends, you got a much better chance of the project succeeding on the first place, and secondly, of not generating some kind of political backlash, which is, I'm sure, why Mr. Obama was so keen on having Arab countries participating with the United States in those air attacks that were carried out in recent days.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thanks for coming to BYU. In recent years, Track 2 diplomacy, where private citizens who have experience in a certain industry will go and kind of lay the ground for diplomatic relations, has kind of taken off. And I'm curious as to what your experience has been with Track 2 diplomacy. Is it effective? Do you see it growing in the future?
Well, it can be useful, I think, particularly in the case of countries with whom we don't have full-blown diplomatic relations. Let's say Iran, for example. There's been some very good Track 2 work that has been done with private citizens in our country talking with various Iranians to see if there are ways of finding different solutions to the problems that we confront. Some of the work that's been done on Cuba, for example. So that would be one example. There's certainly maybe not so much in the area of Track 2 diplomacy, but in the term of the role of think tanks and of others in influencing diplomacy and policy, I think that's much stronger than it used to be. I don't think we had as many resources out there available to the government to call upon to analyze, study, and understand issues, say, 50 years ago as we do today. And that enriches, it seems to me, our thinking about these different issues. Also, the interchange between people who are in government and in these think tanks, and there's a bit of a circulation of these people in and out of government, which I think can also be very helpful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for your remarks tonight. I wanted to ask you about the situation in Iraq. Assuming that the current operations undertaken by the U.S. against ISIL are ultimately successful, at least in terms of driving them out of their currently held territory in Iraq, what reason is there to hope that the end result will be an Iraqi government that's strong enough and capable enough to do what it hasn't been able to do in the last decade?
Yeah, it's a good question. And a tough question. The first thing I'd say, though, is I wouldn't assume that we could be successful in driving them out without some effective ground action on the part of the Iraqis or the Kurds, or probably both. In other words, the airstrikes are not going to be enough to motivate these people to just say, well, okay, well, now because there's so many airstrikes, I'm leaving Mosul. I don't think that's the way it's going to happen. I think they're going to continue to hold on to what they've got. But your question still has got important implications. Will there be an Iraqi government that's able to take advantage of whatever situation is created? And I mean, that's work in progress. I take encouragement from the fact that the Parliament was able to remove Mr. Maliki and appoint another prime minister. And oh, by the way, how many other parliaments in the Middle East have removed their leaders lately? I mean, sometimes I'm not so sure we should be too self-critical about some of the things we encourage the Iraqis to do. Maybe one of the accomplishments looking back 20, 30 years from now may be that Iraq had one of the first genuinely parliamentary governments in the Middle East. I don't know. But at the moment, I think you ask a good question. The last 4 or 5 years have not been very encouraging, and are they going to be able to overcome that? Now, maybe this ISIL threat and all was enough to motivate them finally to think maybe in a more national rather than a sectarian way. But to be honest with you, I don't know that for sure. I mean, that we're going to have to wait and see.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Mr. Ambassador, good evening, and thanks for coming to BYU. We've talked largely tonight about state actors, and my question to you is, what is the role of diplomacy, or soft power, some people would call it, when you, largely around the world right now, we are dealing with non-state actors? So if you talk about the continent of Africa, Eastern Africa, you talk about Al-Shabaab. In the Middle East, we've got ISIL. In South American countries, to some degree, there's MS-13 and what they're doing and its influence throughout South America. What is the role of soft power for those organizations moving forward, sir?
Okay, well, first of all, on the question of whether diplomacy is soft or hard power, I mean, in many circumstances, the most effective diplomacy is the diplomacy that has the full weight and power of the United States behind it, right? When you have the military behind you and with you in these situations, that's when you may be in the best position and have the most leverage to achieve some kind of negotiated outcome. But I think what your question goes to is what influences and what instruments other than military can be used to undercut and to prevent people from joining these kinds of outfits. And to me, this is it's in part a challenge for our diplomacy, but it's an even greater challenge for the governance of these different places. I mean, if you think about it, where these movements have arisen is where governance is weak, where the state that is supposed to be governing that space is either not there or is extremely ineffective. And so therein lies one of the hardest questions of our era, which is what can we, advanced states, do to help these weak governments become more effective without getting totally mired and totally bogged down into this business of nation building. It's a real conundrum because, sure, you can help countries like that, but it almost becomes, frankly, I've seen enough of these situations now, it almost becomes a colonial exercise, right? You got to put lots of people in, you have to have aid officials operating in different offices, you have to almost have like a parallel government of outside helpers to help these people become more effective. So you're raising what I think is just an extremely hard question to answer. What is it that's going to bring back to some of these ungoverned spaces effective governance? And I don't think anybody's found the magic formula for that yet. Some of it obviously relates to, you want to follow up.
No, I was going to say thank you, Mr. Ambassador. I didn't know if you were finished with my question.
No, it's just that I've been thinking about this one so much, but I can't figure it out. Thanks for your question.
To begin, sorry.
Okay, these four, and then that's it. Okay.
Perfect.
Yeah, go ahead.
All right. To begin, thank you so much for coming. I wanted to ask you, You said earlier that one of our most important tactics regarding Syria is going to be making sure that we have troops in Iraq to put pressure on them. Are there any other countries that we're going to have to rely on for what you deemed were our second and third most important countries to worry about, being Russia and China? Are there any other countries that we're going to have to use to assert diplomatic influence on those countries?
Pressure on...
Like pressure on Russia, pressure on China.
Yeah. Well, if I understand your question, I mean, if you're thinking about, none of these situations are ones where it's wise to try and do these things all alone. Certainly in the Middle East, we need to work effectively with the political forces in the region. And I think the response that we've undertaken vis-a-vis in Syria and in Iraq just in the last few days has been working with many of the countries from the Persian Gulf, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and so forth. So that's good. It really would be important to get Turkey more on side. At the moment, Turkey's been going through some political turmoil and uncertainty, and it's not exactly clear to me where they stand on some of these questions. They've been a little more ambivalent than I think we would like them to be, especially both as a European country and as a NATO ally and as a country that fronts right on the region. In dealing with Russia, of course, you got to deal with work with NATO countries and the European Union, and we do. We do that. In fact, we coordinate our sanctions policy with them, and I think to good effect. And in Asia, of course, we work very closely with Japan. We've got to stay joined at the hip with Japan. They're a treaty ally. Got to work with the Koreans. And we got to work with the group of the Southeast Asian nations, the so-called ASEAN group. So in each of these situations, diplomacy and relationships with these other countries is an important element.
Thank you so much.
Hello. It's glad to have you here at BYU. And I have a question about your diplomats, the American diplomats. Do they not study like the Chinese or obviously the leadership in China are dialectical materialists? And we have, I was just thinking about how John F. Kennedy, when he was dealing with Khrushchev, I think he was really shook up, and then the Bay of Pigs took place, and there's so many things that happen because people I don't think, understand the philosophies that are behind the people that we have to deal with. But I was going to say that the most accurate historic document that we have anywhere in the world is the Bible, and it's predicted some things. One thing, for instance, is saying that the Israelites will never get along with the people in the Middle East. It's always going to, there's things that the Bible has already told us are going to happen. I mean, I was wondering if our leadership realized some of the things that are in the scriptures and how they line up with what's going on in the world today.
Yeah, I think I'll answer the first part of your question. I'm not sure I can answer the second part because I think it would depend from president to president. I mean, President Reagan cited the scriptures quite often, certainly privately, and I think he did to a certain extent publicly as well. And others perhaps less so, I mean, in recent times. But as far as studying foreign cultures and societies, that's probably the bread and butter of the Foreign Service. I mean, the coin of the realm, if you will, is language and area expertise, is knowing languages, knowing particular regions of the world. And in that process of learning languages and learning about these areas, you also learn about the political leadership, the history, and so forth. But that doesn't mean that in the end, however well you may understand a society, that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be able to make that perfect assessment of how individual X is going to behave under circumstance Y. I mean, that's just, human behavior just is not that easy to predict, and in fact is quite unpredictable at times.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming, sir. So I was just thinking, so do you see a possibility of the Kurdish region of Iraq becoming independent? And if that were to happen, what would that imply for the Middle East?
Right. I've thought of the Kurdish. Well, I know that region pretty well. I think they've been a factor of stability in Iraq, and I think they've been good for Iraq. And they have people in very important positions in Baghdad, ministers, so the president of Iraq, and so forth. So, I mean, they play a very important role. If they were to become independent, then I think that would maybe make some of the sectarian issues even more difficult in Iraq, because you'd sort of have the Shia and the Sunni basically faced off against each other without this moderating element in the middle. And the other issue is whether it's really whether it would be a viable state, because they count on Baghdad for quite a few of the revenues that they get. And then the last question would be whether neighboring countries like Turkey or Syria or Iran would really want to see an independent Kurdistan. So we've been discouraged. I mean, we, as a matter of U.S. government policy, we understand that they're an autonomous region, and that if push came to shove, they probably could govern themselves, but we have not encouraged that.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming today, Ambassador. I was thinking a lot about how you have a really great world picture and you understand a lot. And I was wondering if you could enlighten us, lay people or civilians, on how we could more develop our understanding of the world and politics in the world.
Well, I mean, first of all, going off on mission is not a bad place to start. I was saying to myself, well, I very often encourage people to go to the Peace Corps, and then I'm beginning to think, well, maybe the Peace Corps has some analogous experience. It's somewhat analogous to the experience of going on mission. But I find once you learn the first foreign language, then the concept of learning foreign languages breaks down, and it's much easier to learn the second and the third, and you realize it's just, you've got to put your mind to it and start memorizing, because that's what a lot of language, and start rehearsing the sounds that you have to utter. Study abroad some, travel. These are the ways to do it. If you're interested in foreign service, I think the good news these days is there's so many different ways of serving abroad these days. I mean, it isn't limited just to being in the diplomatic service. You can be in our aid organization. There's the Peace Corps that I mentioned. You've got the Millennium Challenge Account. You've got a lot of NGOs now that are quite big that have operations abroad, whether it's various religious organizations, or it's the Gates Foundation, or the Ford Foundation, or the Rockefeller Foundation. So there's a plethora of opportunities out there. And so the only thing you got to do is take that first step, it seems to me. My daughter works for the World Food Program of the United Nations, and she's had assignments in 4 different countries. In Italy, which is the headquarters, then she went to India, then she went to Panama, and now she's in Tanzania, in Dar es Salaam, and she's having a great time working on these food issues for the World Food Program. It's a great life.
Thank you.
Last question. You have a great responsibility.
I will try to meet it. Good evening, and thank you for coming and sharing your experiences with us. My question is a bit more general. Can you speak on the level of influence that public opinion and expectation has on policy making?
Right. What influence does public opinion have on policymaking? Well, I can't imagine. First of all, the people who make policy are really the president and the Congress, right? I mean, that's the level, and people like myself really execute policy. We may propose ideas, but we don't really make it. It's the president who makes the policy. And these are political people. They're elected, they're sensitive to public opinion. So I'd say the influence is substantial. The argument you get into, or the debate you get into at times, is whether you should allow, for example, public opinion polls to influence what you're going to do when confronted with some matter of life and death or some matter of great national security import. And I think there's a feeling sometimes that we allow ourselves to be driven a little bit too much by the polls. I would offer that opinion. But you can't stray too far from public opinion in the conduct of American policy. It just won't work. I mean, we've seen that happen time and again. But there are times, critical times in our history, when an issue is so important, so vital, that it's usually by dint of presidential leadership that we end up doing the right thing, whether it's World War II or Lincoln doing what he did. I don't think he thought of taking a poll before he decided whether to try to hold the Union together. But it gets a little more complex when you get down to issues that maybe aren't quite as critical. Thank you. Well, thanks.
Thank you very much. Even after I knocked his notes on the floor and scrambled them, you did all right, so I appreciate that. We want to thank each of you for attending this evening. We hope to see you again at a future Wheatley event. And Ambassador Negroponte, allow me once more to thank you for taking your time and for being with us and for what you've shared with us this evening. Please join me in one more thank you.